Hello, good evening. Welcome to Centenary. My name is Meg Peters, and I serve as the Associate Minister of Evangelism, Engagement, and Missions here. And it is so wonderful to welcome you all this evening. Quick housekeeping things. There are restrooms up these stairs, men to the right, women to the left, or you can go out and walk down the very long hallway if you need to walk. Don't know. But I just want to open us in prayer, and then I will pass it on to Susanna Permanis. So let us pray. Loving God, we thank you so much for the space and the opportunity to have these important conversations. God, we just ask that you will guide the talk that we have this evening. May our hearts be opened, and your call to justice be ever present. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Meg. And my name is Suzanne Eppermanis. I'm currently with our Justice and Reconciliation team, and we welcome you here. We're so excited to see everybody here to join in this conversation, and this is our kickoff of our spring series of panel discussions on a variety of topics, which you see displayed all around you, everywhere you look. Just a few things to open us up here I wanted to share with you. If you're unfamiliar with the United Methodist Church or a guy named John Wesley, he was our founding father of Methodism in the late 1700s. And his thing was that personal holiness is not all of the picture, that social holiness is also really important as well. And so that is a part of our grounding and our for our Justice and Reconciliation ministry. That is a mouthful. We will sometimes just call ourselves the J&R team. And we were actually created by Centenary's Church Council a couple of years ago. It was the spring of 2021 when that was a decision by the council to go ahead and create this committee officially as a new ministry area for our church. The reason we felt this was really important was we feel the church's mission is clearly stated, that being making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. But how do we translate that mission of our church to a J&R? What does that mean, and why do we feel this kind of work in these conversations and ultimately actions in the name of our Lord is important? The way we see it is it's really just the way we portray loving our neighbor. We feel like loving our neighbor, Jesus says, love thy neighbor as yourself. We feel that one important way of doing that in action is actually working proactively for justice. So that's just a little bit of the backdrop to our J&R team and our ministry and how we got started. I would like to just take a real quick second and just ask the members of the steering committee to stand, if you would please, so that you can be recognized. That would be Nicole Johnson, Ellen Kirby, Martha Logeman, Lori Young, and myself, Suzanne Eppermanis. So thank you all. And we have another team of volunteers as well that are helping to put together these events. So thank you all. For your reference, when you came into the auditorium, you were handed a packet of information. On the front, I hope you have a little quiz, test of your knowledge on the front page that will not be handed in. We won't even ask you it, but there are answers on the back if you finally give up and just need to check your answer sheet. So you'll also find in it the biographies of panelists as well as resources to learn and do more, some links if you want to learn more about some organizations, including our own United Methodist Church principles and heritage in social justice. And the very last page of your handout is going to be something at the end of our time here together this evening. We'll ask you to tear off and give us your feedback in a variety of forms, as well as including how you would like to be involved in future efforts, whether they be learning efforts or ultimately action, to take action in these areas. So I will say just real quickly, the topics that we are looking at in our spring series, which you've seen in all these various promotional flyers, they were selected. This time last year, our J&R team surveyed the congregation and said, what topics would you like to learn more about? So that is really where that list of this spring topics came from. A couple of folks have asked that question. I think it's really important, and it's a great question. So I wanted to share that as well. Okay, we have panelists with us now joining for the evening. And I will say that we have Dr. Russ Smith, we have Paula McCoy. This evening, due to a last-minute conflict, unfortunately, we do not have either Chief of Police William Penn or Assistant City Manager Patrice Toney. So that is unfortunate. We will miss them as part of this conversation, but we are absolutely so excited that we have Dr. Smith and Paula McCoy with us this evening to share what they have to share with us for the evening. We also have our moderator, Dr. Stephen Sills, with the United Way, Chief Impact Officer. And if you haven't already browsed the biographies in your handout, I would really, really encourage you to just see a little more of the information about these panelists this evening and the breadth and depth of experience, the wealth of knowledge they bring to us. And those biographies are on pages 2 and 3, I believe. So I don't want to do any more talking because I really want to hand the microphone over to Dr. Stephen Sills, our guest moderator and expert on his own in so many areas, but we're so glad to have him with us this evening. And Dr. Sills, take it away.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here this evening talking about very important issues in our community, looking at them from a variety of lenses and understandings, and hopefully looking forward to some solutions to addressing the social problems that we experience in our community. As we delve into the overview of our current realities, we'll cast a light on opportunities that lie ahead. Together, we're going to explore the depths of issues at hand, from economic disparities to housing and food insecurity, and the recent surge of community violence in our community. This evening's not just about dialogue, but it's also about action. We'll seek to understand not only what's holding our people back, but how each of us can play a role in changing the story. We'll begin tonight with both Dr. Russ Smith and Ms. Paula McCoy giving us an introductory look at their work that they're engaged in. To begin with, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to share their perspectives on the most pressing challenges our community faces. Could you enlighten us? What are the 1 or 2 issues that you believe are most detrimental to our community currently? And what are the barriers preventing all residents of Winston-Salem from truly thriving here? Dr. Smith.
Appreciate it. Can you guys hear me? Great. Good evening. Glad to see everybody. So many people come out for the conversation tonight. And I'm going to go pretty obvious since I'm a professor of geography. I think it's spatial inequalities that we have, inequalities across space that have persisted for decades. And as much time and effort and funding is spent trying to tackle, whether it's food deserts or low-performing schools or crime, these things tend to continue to happen in the same spaces. And some of the reasons for that is what was once forced residential segregation by race is now economic segregation. And in the United States, race and income are correlated, so there still is that racial component to it. And I think later on we'll go into a little bit more detail. But if there's any realtors, you know, location matters, geography matters, and where you live says a lot about all the opportunities you have. I know next month, I think I saw you're going to talk about economic mobility. That's been strongly linked to place. School districts, access to medical care, food. I mean, all these basic things are place-based issues. And in our community, they can be mapped, as we've done, and might share some maps with you a little bit later. Again, I'm a geographer. I like a map. And so as a result, we're going to need to think about space in a different way. And what I mean by that is, my wife's a physical therapist, and it's funny how we view the world so differently. She tends to not notice things that happen on the horizon, and I always notice like the littlest change. And I always forget, coming from a geographic viewpoint, that a lot of people view it more like my wife. They just don't think community changes or neighborhoods change or places change. But all we have to look is where we're sitting today in downtown Winston-Salem. It wasn't too long ago that downtown Winston-Salem didn't look like what it looks like now. And, you know, it took $1 billion of public and private money to change it. And some people might argue that there's good things about that, and there's some problems that brought with it as well. But it did change. And I think so many communities get stuck in this rut of those spaces over there that's the way they've always been, and that's the way it's always going to be. But we can change them. We can do things to actually improve communities that are disadvantaged. And often, if we go back in the history, it's not because of things that they did, but things that were done to them that we can point out. We've got a new project coming out through the Spatial Justice Studio that I'm hoping to talk to you guys about before we finish tonight, give you an opportunity to volunteer. So at the end of the day, the geography of one's situation has a lot to do with many of the issues facing the communities that are in persistent need of help.
Thank you, Ms. McCoy.
Okay, can you hear me? I work with an organization called Partnership for Prosperity. It was put in place around 2017 as part of the Mayor's Poverty Thought Force. And out of that thought force, 56 recommendations came into play in terms of how do we end poverty. And those were around housing, education, health and wellness, food insecurity, and jobs and workforce development. So in my opinion, poverty is one of our most pressing issues. And poverty is, we might say the root cause could be racism, but it is the lack of resources for people. And those 5 social determinants that I just mentioned are all connected. So people who are in poverty are housing insecure. They have education inequalities. They are food insecurity, healthcare inequities, and they lack job skills. So all those things are related. And so I think that not only are they related, but they cause a whole host of other issues, like homelessness and hopelessness, crime. Our issues are exacerbated, particularly after COVID. And since COVID, not much has changed. I just want to share a few statistics with you. During that time, around 2017, Winston-Salem had one of the worst childhood poverty rates in the country. And this was reported by Triad Business Journal in 2019. The report shows that 1/3, 35% children that live in Winston-Salem live in poverty. And with the higher places like Chicago and Dallas, places like that, Pittsburgh, we were higher than those places. And we ranked 20th in the nation for the highest childhood poverty rate. And so it even went further to say that African American children, at least 39% of them, who live in poverty, and this was in 2013, said the highest of any racial group. And one study showed that 42% of African Americans born into the lowest income category remain there as adults. So economic mobility in our community is really dismal for people in poverty. And so to me, that is one of our most pressing issues, and one that we need to address if we're going to solve some of the problems that we have around guns, around violence, and those types of issues.
I think it's important to point out that you've presented 2 sides of the same coin. The policies of a century and a half ago that were place-based have resulted in the need for place-based solutions, whether it's $1 billion or the intentional focus on poverty in specific hotspots. Let's talk a little bit more about spatial justice. Dr. Smith, could you provide us a little bit more of an understanding of the inequalities that we see in the space, in the social space, social geography of Winston-Salem? Share with us the Neighborhood Opportunity Atlas that you've developed with the Spatial Justice Studio at the Center for Design and Innovation at Winston-Salem State. And tell us a little bit about some of the neighborhood-based disparities we see in that atlas.
Great. Can I think if I can, I'll just pop up and do it from the computer. Might be easier. Give us 1 second. All right, yeah, great. So yeah, appreciate again the opportunity to come here and speak. It's weird not to feel like I'm in a class on a Sunday, but that's okay. Everyone's good? Okay, great. And for the last 6 years, I founded and have led this thing called the Spatial Justice Studio. How many people have heard of spatial justice? Oh, good. All right. The message is getting out there. For those that didn't raise your hand, I was with you. I agree. I don't know what that meant. The first time I read it, I thought, like, what are they trying to talk about here? What is, I've heard of racial justice, and I've heard of economic justice, and I've heard of, all these different types of justice. And then as a geographer, I started thinking, well, it's really hard to have any of those other justices if the ground that we're occupying isn't fair, if it isn't more equitable, isn't inclusive, doesn't have access to everybody. And so I came across this book called Seeking Spatial Justice, and it served two purposes for me. One, I used to be a city planner, and when I was a planner, I had issues with some of the things, how we did things. We did everything by the book, by the laws, by the statutes. But often at the end of a meeting, like where the council would be up here in the audience, and we'd leave, and decisions we made, I'd often feel like, yeah, I guess everything went the way it was supposed to. We had 2 meetings and people spoke and there was a vote, but I often felt like the decision to build another Walmart really wasn't in the best interest of everybody, but we did it. And when I came across this term, spatial justice, it started to kind of echo in my mind of saying, like, maybe this is the term for something that I've been missing, something that I didn't know. The second part, as you heard in my bio, I teach at Winston-Salem State University, and I was trying to connect to students that are not like me, and teach them about how they could have a voice in decisions in planning and engineering and in architecture and in the community and nonprofit world. And when I talked about land use planning and I talked about annexation, their eyes just rolled over. But when I rolled in with spatial injustice, everyone's like, whoa, what is that? I like the sound of that. What is that? And maybe it's like an area that floods a lot, or you live in an area that doesn't have access to a grocery store. Oh, I have family that lives in a place like that, or I know exactly what you're talking about. We just never know what to call it. And now this term came along that identified, they gave a voice to something that many of us have known about all our life, the fact that places are unequal. So, I'm going to go ahead here. In terms of a definition, this is, I think, one of the better definitions I've found. It's a colleague of mine in the Netherlands, but it's referring to this general access to all the things you need to be successful in life, right? That we need public goods, we need basic services, we need culture, economic opportunity. The environment needs to be healthy. And how we provide these things in spaces is really critical and important. And what we've done a good job with as a society across the United States and in many Western developed countries is provide it for the middle and upper class. Like that's easy. We're all able to get these things in abundance, right? And we have no problem. But for older populations, it becomes an issue. For younger populations and for disadvantaged communities of color, low-income communities, they don't have the same access opportunity. They're not included in many of these same things as the vast majority of people. The other thing to consider when we're talking about this idea of spatial justice is that space is interesting because there's a physical geography, right? There's an actual how the land is and what has a higher elevation and a lower elevation and what's good soil and what land floods more. And that is kind of predetermined, right? That's the ground as it exists. But then on top of that, we put this social layer of decisions that we make as a society that creates opportunities and prosperity in some locations and then dumps burdens on other communities. And that could be seen with zoning, with financing, with transportation planning. If we go back in history, I know at the end of this you're going to have the redlining exhibit. We can talk about deed restrictions and covenants. All these things are social pieces that have been put on top of the physical geography that have created uneven playing fields, uneven surfaces. And so I am aware that at the end of the day, there's always going to be some degree of spatial inequality, right? Some land is better than other lands, but we have exacerbated that by the decision-making that we've made as a society, and so it creates these problems that persist to today. The other thing to consider when we talk about spatial justice is there's like multiple ways of looking at justice, right? Most of us probably are coming at it from a distributive point of view, like that where is stuff? So not too far from here, you might live by a neighborhood that's got 5 grocery stores, right? Things, an overabundance, a density, a distribution kind of on the one heavy end of the scale. And then there's other communities not too far from this location that don't have any grocery store within 1, 2, 3 miles of them. That's the distributive aspect. The procedural is how we get there. Like what is the decision-making process? Do we hold meetings to determine things at 6 o'clock on Monday? And, who comes to those meetings? What if people work second shift or have kids or, the procedure is another component of it. And then finally is kind of the historical lens of understanding what's happened in the past that influences the geography of today. And that's a big component of spatial justice, to understand what's happened in the past, but it also bleeds through today so that we can begin making amends maybe for some of those decisions that were not equal. Of course, at the end of the day, the urban environment that we live in impacts all of us, right? This geography impacts where we live, where we work, where you shop, where the kids go to school, what kind of environment, air you're breathing. So it's a really important thing that permeates all of our life. It's something you can't divorce yourself from, living in kind of this urban environment, and depending on what you call home, what neighborhood. To get a little more specific, because people are like, okay, well, you're talking about spatial justice as this broad thing. These are some examples of what might be considered spatial injustices, right? Everyone in here, I think, is familiar with food insecurity or food deserts. Transit deserts, we've done some research around, like, where do people have opportunities to get around? It's always surprising when I talk to my classes and say, 85% or so of people have an automobile. 15% don't. How did they get places, right? Often the people that don't have an automobile live in close proximity to downtown, where you used to have factories and they could walk to work. Those jobs don't exist in that location anymore. Those jobs are out in the suburban fringes. And if you don't have an automobile to get to Union Cross Road, the bus can't take you there. It gets expensive to take Uber every day back and forth. So we have issues with just getting people around to take advantage of opportunities that we know exist. We know there are jobs, but how do you get the people to them? Environmental injustices, that one, is often, people know a lot about that, looking at, the placement of everything from landfills to polluting industry, residential segregation, economic mobility. All these things have a spatial component to them. This map here shows the physical geography of Forsyth County. So the red and orange are the higher elevations, and the lower, the green and yellow, are the lower elevations. And if anyone's familiar with it, well, the mountains are to the west, the coast is to the east, the water starts in one place and rolls downhill to the other place. Right? That's the physical geography, right? That's the way the land is. On top of that is where the spatial injustice comes in, where we place social creations on top of that geography that further imbalances what might already be some imbalance. Because if you live in a low-lying area, the chances of it flooding are greater than if you live at the top of a mountain, right? I mean, that's just the reality. A couple maps here that I was asked to share with you. This shows the percentage of minority residents by census tract. So the darker the shading of the blue, the higher the percentage of communities of color. And you might be able to pick out 52, and those communities kind of straddle either side of 52, beginning in the north, wrapping around kind of where it ends into regular 40. Of course, as you get out into the further parts away from the center of town, the minority population decreases. Income, this shows, and this slide's a little bit old, but it's still true today. We have median household income. If we just go west of where we are now, a census tract over of downtown, we have an average median household income of $140,000. If we go just north of WSSU, the other side of downtown, $15,000. That's median household income according to census data. So a difference of more than $100,000 separated by less than a mile as the crow flies. Now, most people say, well, education, work ethic, all these things, some people are going to make more, some people are going to make less. If we put on top of it the same two neighborhoods, life expectancy, 81.4 years on the west side of downtown, less than 68 years. So a full decade just based on where you live. You're going to live a decade less if you're living on the east side of downtown compared to the west side. As I mentioned earlier, my wife works for Cone, physical therapist in Greensboro. They have their own map because they're looking at these issues. Theirs is north and south of downtown. They have about a decade difference in life expectancy. And so I say that because, some people readily say, well, yeah, some people make more, some people make less. Is anyone here saying like, yeah, some people should live 10 years less than other people? I mean, I think that's a harder thing to make, and it's all tied, again, back to this space, back to this neighborhood, back to the location in which people are occupying these neighborhoods. The Neighborhood Opportunity Atlas was a website that we developed in coordination with the county, with Map Forsyth, and it built upon a project that they had been doing for about 10 years called the Distressed Communities Report. And it was something that they published, and it basically had 50 maps, and every map showed East Winston in this horrible red color, saying it was the worst of crime, poverty, and every category. There's like the rest of the county was okay, and this area is bad, bad, bad. We said, you know what, maybe we can look at some different variables, and maybe we can compare things to like how the county's doing on average, and standardize stuff so we can try to identify unique things, because not every neighborhood is the same, right? It might be low performing in several categories, but I bet you we can map and find what's the key thing. And so we've done that. This is the third year we're doing this project with updating every variable in the data set, and we map it. And I might be able to pull it up a little bit later, but I want to make sure I'm cognizant of our panel discussion and time. But it's somewhere you can go to yourself. It's called fcnoa.org. And all the data on there is accessible to the public. You can download anything you want. You can look at over 50 maps. You can hover on the maps and pick out the data points that you want to know about. We have everything from tree canopy, right? Like how much tree coverage there are for sustainability, climate change purposes, for electric bill. You know, the more trees you have, the lower your electric bill is going to be in the summer. We have stuff in there about grocery stores, to percentage of population disabled, to then housing information, and as you can see the categories, stuff about the built environment and infrastructure and education. So I encourage you to look at that, and if we do have a moment, I can always...
We're good on time. So
I
if
can
you
pull it
wanna
up?
go ahead and-
Oh, okay, I'm going to try to pull it up then. All right, give me a second here.
And I'd also say the link is on your list of links in your handout, the actual link is linked.
All right, so here it is live. Yeah, see the bus moves? Kind of cool. If you look across the top here, these are pull-down menus. The interesting thing I'll start with, just for your information, we have a track facts, and oops, sorry, I clicked off of it. I'm not used to this cursor. The track facts, and every census tract in the county has one of these sheets associated with it, where if you're just looking to know more about one community, you can pull up this PDF, and it's usually 2 to 3 pages, and it gives you the geography, the population, some key demographic information, the major roads or landmarks, and then this graph show you what that census tract is doing better statistically than other census tracts, and what it's doing worse. So you see the blue, this census tract here is showing street connectivity, so it's a very high street connectivity score, meaning there's lots of different ways to get into that census tract, to connect to the surrounding neighborhoods. The other 3 with the red show different issues with the community, where they're doing not as well as the county average, and you can see high school dropout rate seems to be a problem in census tract 1, crime rate, and then not as bad because the red bar is smaller, percent of land that is residential, not as much residential, and that's not really, we could argue that's not an issue, but it is when we compare it to the others. So that's the first thing I'll show you. There's all 95 different maps and those track facts. Then we can get into actually some of the maps themselves, and I'll just click on 1 or 2 here. So here's one about health insurance, percentage of residents without health insurance. And so what we did was we collected the raw data for every census tract, standardized it, and then compared it to the county average, saying, okay, the county is here. If we're better than the county, it's going to be blue, and if we're worse than the county, it's going to be red. Now, somebody that's into statistics might point out a fatal flaw in this. The county average has got to be good to start with, because if it's really low, well then what is that? Or if it's really high, you know, everyone might be doing okay. So it was a barometer, it's a place to start. So you can see these red census tracts. For example, right here, it's showing the census tract is 25.5% of the people that live there are without health insurance, and the overall county average is 10.7, the state is 10.5. You can hover on any of these and pull up these little pull-out menus, and that works for any of the maps that you find in here. So if we go down here and look at something like home ownership rate, same thing. You can see we hover over it, you can get the state average, the county average, and then that track itself. And then if you go all the way to the end, to the county trends, we have We created some opportunity successes and other issues. And what this means is we identified what was the biggest challenge and success for each track. So you can see here when I pull on over this census tract, the best thing that this had was a short distance to grocery stores. That was the highest rated variable in that for that census tract in the set. And then we do also have, some longitudinal data that looks at like change over time. So as we collect data and we can go from a starting point to the future, we can look and say, well, what's happening as we move over time? And so you can see the blue ones are places where poverty is getting less. And in red, they're getting worse compared to the original time point.
If you're not an urban planner and
Yeah.
you're not a city council person, how can you use this information? How can a church like this apply the information to their neighborhoods, to their volunteer activities? What can they do with this information?
I think, it was created for the purpose for use by multiple stakeholders. So clearly the county staff, city staff sees this as a tool to kind of get right into some data to identify neighborhoods and communities in need. I think the general public can use it for that as well. The nonprofit world, I think, I don't live in Winston. I live in Greensboro, I'm sorry. But I come here all the time, right? I come even on a Sunday night. And it's interesting to me, when I first started coming here, everyone always talked about East Winston. And I was like, where's West Winston? Oh, no, there's Ardmore, and there's the West End, and there's Winnebago. Oh, okay. And I think why I kind of give that anecdote there is because on the mapping, once you map things, you can see that it's not a monolith. That there's differences to different spaces and places and the people that occupy them. And to this one size of like, we're just going to fix poverty for this whole swath, I don't know that after 70, 80 years of fixing poverty that we've gotten anywhere. Now, that brings, and as an academic, I think I can say this, not because I'm not running for office or an elected official or anything. We also have to ask ourselves, do we want to fix it? Is 10, 12, 15% poverty just okay if I don't see it, if I don't have to interact with it, if my geography is such that it doesn't interfere with my well-being? I think those are some of the questions that people have to kind of dig down and think about is, okay, can we be more deliberate, to go back to your point, can we look at something and say, I really want to fix affordability of home ownership or something. I want to fix tree canopy. I'm just random stuff here. And we're going to not be this broad, we're going to use a scalpel. And we're going to go a block or a neighborhood or a couple blocks and really measure change and try to impact things that are on the ground that are real, as opposed to just saying, well, it's a big problem and we're going to continue to do the same thing we've done all these years. It leads me to another point that I think is really important that people should consider, and again, I don't know if I'm right on this or not. I also think we need to reevaluate how we measure success. Success tends to be based on profit. And for 60, 70, 80 years, these communities that have been disadvantaged, that have had these issues, if profit wins in those communities, that means they've been gentrified. That means that it's changed over. And I don't think that's what we want for these communities, that we need to say, okay, success isn't a grocery store moving in and making lots of money. A success is providing food in an insecure food area, in a food desert, so that people are healthier, that rates of diabetes go down, that heart disease go down, that kids, when they go to school, they have something in their stomach and they can do better on standard tests, and that raises the school. I think measuring our end results in non-budgetary, well, that's very difficult, is somewhere, if we want to tackle these things, we need to move towards. We need to move away from just like okay, it cost this, and here was our return, or we lost that. When I worked in city government, I always joke around, budget time, the fire department never made money, but yet every budget they got another fire truck. Any fire people, I love you, thank you for all your service. But it's like we just decided as a society that is something that we fund, right? And should we fund better schools in communities that don't have them? Should we fund food in communities that, I think that's the way we need to think about it, because to think we're going to continue to just, what works, the market and how it works in the communities that are successful will not work in the communities that have been unsuccessful. And I think 60, 70, 80 years of trying has proven that.
Thank you so much. We'll turn now to Paula McCoy to talk just a little bit about how do we address these hotspots? How do we address these issues? And kind of flipping the coin, not just looking at the deficits within a community, but the assets that are there. Paula is the director of the Partnership for Prosperity that really does take that map and look at the hotspots and say, how do we work bottom up on fixing things? Paula?
Yeah, so just to say a little bit more about P4P, or Partnership for Prosperity, we seek to collaborate with the community on issues that'll help move the needle of poverty. So it's in our name, Partnership for Prosperity. We look for partnerships, for collaborators, and we want to align the resources that Russell mentioned that are missing in some of our poorest communities. We want to help align them so that they are effectively and purposefully and efficiently used to benefit our most vulnerable populations, which is the poor, and the people who lack the resources that they need to function effectively. And so, furthermore, we seek to break down the silos by changing the adversarial mindsets that operate from an attitude of distrust or competition. And we advocate for policies that do not exacerbate the wealth gap and that allow for families and individuals to experience economic mobility. We began addressing earnestly the social justice and equity issues that will help reduce poverty. And again, we did it through a collaborative, place-based approach. So we're working in neighborhoods, one neighborhood at a time, trying to move the needle. We started that in 2019, and we have some partners, of course, that work with us. We don't work directly, do direct service delivery, but we work directly with our residents in these communities. But we work with the neighborhood leaders, we work with residents, we work with service providers. And we want the service providers to address the issues that marginalized communities have that keep them from, having a sustainable and a thriving community. And when we do this, we don't do this, we're perpetuating place-based poverty. So the place-based strategy that we use to reduce poverty, that allows us to work collaborative with neighborhoods, it's a resident-led approach. Residents are actually leading this, and we're there to support them in the decisions that they make. When we unleash the power that is already in the community, amazing things happen. And we have seen that in the work that we do. The physical, the social, the structural, and the economic conditions of the community that affect the well-being of the families and the children that live there, it is strengthened when we use this approach. And it allows us to work with service providers so that they are connecting the dots. So a housing issue is an education issue. It's a food insecurity issue. They're all connected. It's a healthcare issue. And so connecting the dots to the 5 social determinants of health, which are the determinants of how people live, how they work, how they play, how they age, how they worship. Those are the things that we are looking at, and they determine how we work in those communities. The mission for Partnership for Prosperity is to engage residents with lived experience in creating solutions that reduce poverty by, again, eliminating silos, aligning resources, and advocating for policies through a racial equity lens. We have a vision of a world where childhood poverty ceases to exist, because we believe that aspiring to end childhood poverty, generational poverty can be eliminated. Generational poverty, and you all know this, is defined as a family living in poverty for at least 2 generations and are challenged with 3 other forms of poverty. And that is educational poverty, parental poverty, and spiritual poverty. The cumulative effect of these different forms of poverty sometimes create the most damaging outcome of generational poverty, and that's hopelessness. Hopelessness is the key factor in creating the cycle, one generation to the next. And so without hope and the belief that life can be better, the motivation and the energy needed to break the cycle is very low. And so the initiative that we use in these neighborhoods, we call it Moving Families Forward. And our vision, again, is a world where childhood poverty ceases to exist. And so we have, several goals for working with neighborhoods where they are decision makers, they are working together, they are creating and planning for their own futures. They're solving their problems. But one of the things that we do, again, promote collaboration among the institutions that are engaged in these communities. We talk about silos, people working, in their own little tunnels, in their own ways. We have to work together to solve this problem. And so we try to bring people together and help them understand what we want to accomplish in this place-based approach. We use study circles. Study circles, working groups. The residents actually are sitting at their table and they are planning for their neighborhoods. They are figuring out what the issues are and they are creating solutions to solve those. We have a lot of expertise in our communities. We use an asset-based community development approach, which means that residents are at the center and they have tremendous amounts of strengths. And they make decisions and develop solutions to poverty and inequality. And these are problems that they're dealing with that help determine their futures. And then the study circles that they are involved in, they get continuous feedback. We get continuous feedback from them as they are talking about the issues in their communities. And they call in service providers, people who they think that can help them. And we have 3 questions that we ask community. What is it that you can do for yourself? Because part of our motto is, don't do for others what they can do for themselves. Don't do for others what they can do for themselves. The other one is, what is it that you can do or that you may need some help with? And then they call those people to the table. And then what is it that you need someone else from the outside to do for you? Our approach is an inside-out approach. We believe that top-down decision-making doesn't move the needle. It hasn't moved the needle. And in fact, it has moved the needle in the other direction. And so a bottoms-up, resident-led approach is one that we're seeing great results from. And then we work with neighborhood leaders. We ensure that they are equipped with the leadership skills that they need to help lead their communities and to help them create the change that they are seeking. We work with residents to help create an asset map. So asset-based community development is just looking at neighborhoods through a strength-based lens and not a deficit lens. So we're not looking at what is wrong with this neighborhood. This is something that we all been taught that's how we get funding, right? We look at what's wrong, what's broken, what isn't working in these neighborhoods. But our approach is looking at what's good, what's working, what is the gifts and talents that people have, and what is it that we can help them use in order to make the decisions to improve their quality of life. And then we help them become aware of data. So we do a baseline survey when we go into a neighborhood. We share that information with the residents so they can look at it and make decisions based on that data. So it's very data-driven, and they get to understand what it is to measure performance and all of that. And then finally, we help the residents seek resources, because that's what they lack. They lack the resources. In some of our neighborhoods, we haven't made investments in 50 years. And so we need more investments in our neighborhoods. And so we help them learn how to write grants, learn how to become in relationships with philanthropists, and seek the funds that they need to move the needle in their communities. So this is the work that we do, assist the neighborhoods to have a sustainable community. And we have seen some tremendous results.
Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the successes, particularly in addressing housing and how you've helped the community get resources to fix their homes?
Yeah, there are two neighborhoods that we've been working in since 2019. One is Casa Heights, which is in a Place Matters, United Way has a Place Matters department, I guess you can say. And they work in 13 neighborhoods, and Casa Heights is one of those neighborhoods. Casa Heights is a neighborhood that is 75% home ownership and 25% renters. And most of the renters there really want to become homeowners. And the median income in Casa Heights is $44,000. So it's not one of the poorest neighborhoods. You have homeowners that's been there for at least 70 years. And so when they started study circles, housing was their number one issue. But they did study circles in all 5 of those social determinants of health that I mentioned. And they formed, obviously out of the study circles came a community action plan. So they created an action plan for themselves that they are now implementing. So one of the issues was housing. The houses in Casa Heights have been there for at least 70 years, if not more, and they are in disrepair. They have had very little investment in them, and so they wanted to repair some of the homes so that they could pass it along to other generations. The city has a program called TURN, Transforming Urban Residential Neighborhoods, which this neighborhood could not qualify for. And that's a project of the city where you could borrow money at 3% interest to repair your home. And then after 5 years, that loan becomes a grant if you stay in the house for 5 years. Well, this neighborhood couldn't qualify for that because of their average medium income. And so because housing was a critical issue for them, they began a home repair program. So they are, in fact, right now, doing some renovation of the houses. I think they have, in phase 1, they selected 10 houses to repair. And they started off with very little money. We were able to provide them with $100,000 to begin the process. And they have allocated about $5,000 per house. And they're doing things like roofing, repairing the roofs, repairing bathrooms and plumbing, repairing some outside things, buying HVACs that folk need. And they are engaged. These are residents that live there. They got their own contractors. They selected them. They did all the work themselves. And we are just there to support them in those efforts. We have another neighborhood that we are currently working in that is on the other end of the spectrum than Casa Heights. This neighborhood is called Salem Gardens, and it is 100% multifamily units. The manager tells us that no one there has an income, which is hard to believe, but all of the units are subsidized. And so the issues that they face around housing is one of evictions. So as you know, Winston-Salem is 19th in the country in terms of evictions. So we have a high eviction rate. And the residents there are being evicted for things like reporting repairs that they need done that the management is not doing. And so if they report that, if they call in code enforcement, they get an eviction letter. And so, which leads to homelessness, because as you all know, it's hard to find housing now, and particularly housing at 30% median income. It's very difficult to find housing, and so a lot of people are really hurting and suffering. And you know, there are a lot of other issues that they're facing with. We haven't been able to really do our moving families forward there in earnest, which we generally start with housing or what's most pressing for them because of these little fires that we've been putting out with landlord-tenant relations. Some of those issues involve their inability to use their community center. They have a community center there. They're not allowed to use it. You know, they have storage units. For each unit, there's a storage unit. They are not allowed to use their storage unit. So there are a lot of issues that low-income rental people who are renting are faced with. It's not just happening in Salem Gardens, of course. We get calls from other areas where they're facing some of the same issues. And so sometimes they're silenced because of that. Because if they have no place to go, then they can't speak out for their rights. But we're hoping that in this neighborhood, we are forming a tenants association, because residents, if they speak by themselves, hardly anything happens. But if they can speak as a collective, if they can organize, then they may get a little bit more attention. And we've been able to have meetings with the residents, with the mayor, you know, to help see if we can resolve some of the issues that they are having. But housing, obviously, is their number one issue as well, just in a different way. So these are some of the things that we're doing in the neighborhoods. We are having success because more and more people, for instance, in Salem Gardens, are speaking out. They're speaking up. They are forming their tenant association, and we expect that we'll be getting some results for them.
Thank you so much. I think that gives us a really good idea of how we can address some of these issues at a community level, at a grassroots level, that bottom up. Working with the data, working with the community members, identifying strengths, and then using those strengths to fix issues. Is this our volunteer opportunity?
Well, I mean, I was just going to kind of wrap up a few things.
Sure.
I mean, when I talk to people about spatial justice, one of the things I always think is important to talk about is that these injustices that are geographic have community-wide impacts, right? Everything from public health issues for the whole county, right? We used to think this public health was, this thing that affected certain areas, then COVID came and affected the globe, right? I mean, we're all in the same boat when it comes to public health. Education inequalities, right? Those across the entire county are felt with the good schools being overcrowded, or a lot of people wanting to go, and the poor ones not having the resources it needs. So you have these huge issues. If your people are unhealthy and they're not educated, guess what? Unprepared workforce. So all the people out there trying to hire, trying to find people to make their business successful, it becomes much more difficult. And again, it gets back down to kind of the geography. Growing income inequalities, residential segregation patterns that were forced upon us that are still with us today. Going back to that whole idea of mixing homes and different types of uses and density, right? Think about most of the world that we live in today. It's like, here's a cul-de-sac neighborhood, and it's got $150,000 homes because there's only brick on the front. And over here, there's a $300,000, and they have brick on 3 sides. And over here, it's $500,000. I mean, we segregate everything so much And then, as a planner, we name it for what we destroyed, right? Like Meadow Run, where the deer used to run, but now there's no more deer. Anyway, Pine Forest, no more pines. Declining property values. At the end of the day, what this means is those of us that are fortunate are paying a larger share because the other areas are devalued. And if we could just make them more sustainable, make those communities more complete, that value would then go up for them. And government never gives money back, I know. But you could justify maybe balancing out the taxes and everything. So it's something, we're all in this together as a whole community. It doesn't need to seem to be like, oh, well, we just need to do these things for this one part of town. It'll benefit everybody in the long run. These are just a list of things, and I can talk more to people, but like what had happened to get us to many of the spatial injustices we feel, from having racialized zoning ordinances in the community, to redlining through the Homeowners Loan Corporation program, to covenants and deed restrictions. And this is a project that we're just kicking off through the Spatial Justice Studio, and it's modeled after something at the University of Minnesota. We are getting ready to start an analysis, a data analysis of every deed in Forsyth County from 1900 to 1970, using AI that'll identify which ones have the potential of a deed restriction or a racialized covenant. And what that means is from a period of the 1920s to the 1950s, property owners, developers, realtors put deed restrictions and these covenants on property and registered them at the Forsyth County Register of Deeds that said this property can only be purchased by Caucasians, or anyone of Negro blood cannot purchase property in this subdivision. And they were enforceable by law. And so we are going to analyze these, collect this data, and then we're going to go through a community process where we engage the entire community. We have people from the school system, all the universities, United Way, the cities on board to some degree, the planning staff, private corporations, where we're going to go through, and we have to do a couple things. We have to identify where these took place, like get a map, create a map with them, when it was, and then we also have to verify what the computer tells us. Because sometimes the computer's wrong. You might not know that, right? Yeah. Sometimes the computer says, oh, here's a deed restriction. It says right there, it says the word black. Oh, it's Black Street. That doesn't mean, or White Street, right? Just because that word's there. So this effort, what we're hoping to do is engage the entire community around a conversation where we kind of crowdsource this data. We collect stories. And then my goal is actually to try to generate a fund that we can take dollars from foundations, from businesses, from government, whoever wants to give it, and to actually put it into chosen communities to fix things today. Maybe it goes into some of the groups that Paula was talking about. Maybe it goes into a community that we haven't even talked about yet. That takes the history of what happened, because if you were an African American and buy a house in a neighborhood that you weren't allowed to, the value of the intergenerational wealth transfer would have been much greater than if you bought it in Reynoldstown or in Columbia Heights or in a part of East Winston. And so we want to acknowledge what happened in the past. We want to understand it. We want to see the spatial patterns of these inequalities. But I also want to have a conversation and engage the community about what can we do today to make it better. Can we offer low-interest loans? Can we buy some land and set up, maybe it's a bunch of land that everyone rents and it becomes a community land trust. Again, I don't have all the answers. I just want to ask the right questions and then hopefully get people that are smarter than me to say, hey, this is how you should invest that $1 million you raised, right? $1 billion for downtown. If we had $1 million for this, that'd be pretty good. Not $1 billion. But if you're interested in learning more or volunteering or engaging with this project, you can scan that QR code. I'll leave it up there for a while. But would love to have your support in mapping prejudice in Forsyth County. Between the red lines, I know it's really hard for you to see. That's actually for a language specific to deeds here in Forsyth County. So we've already identified some.
So I'm coming to Winston after having worked for 23 years in Guilford County. Before that, Detroit, Arizona, but I'm from Greensboro originally. Just bought a house in Ardmore, so moving this way. I worked with the Reparations Commission in High Point and helped them author the report as well as the recommendations, and currently working with the YWCA of High Point for their own racial equity scorecard and follow-up activities. Here's some of the recommendations that came out of the work group for High Point. Improve access to quality prenatal care. We have a high infant mortality rate in the Black community that's unexcusable in the 21st century. Expand job opportunity and wage equity. Address systemic racism in schools. When we look at Winston-Salem Forsyth schools, and it's already experienced some justice interventions as it relates to suspensions, expulsions of Black and Hispanic youth. Improve public transportation. If you can't get to the daycare, if you can't get to the job, if you can't get to the food, the Forsyth Tech, you name it, you're cut off. And we have neighborhoods where 45% of households in this county do not have access to transportation. Enhance voter registration efforts. People need to be able to participate in decision-making at all levels. Crime prevention and community engagement needs to start bottom-up and top-down, working together, not just high-tech policing that comes in from above. Promoting homeownership and fair lending. We mentioned community land trusts, a great vehicle for getting into homeownership in a low-cost shared equity model. Affordable housing initiatives across the board. Housing, housing, housing. The missing middle. The mixed income, mixed use developments. Getting back to the old urbanism in new urbanism. Improving access to quality health care, not just at the hospital, and we've got 2 great hospitals here, but in the neighborhood itself, that preventative care. Finally, promoting digital inclusion. Cedric's been working a lot on getting better access for individuals onto high-speed, regular, and reliable internet. We saw during the pandemic that it put kids behind not having that access. So I think there's a lot that's going on. I'm with the community, with the United Way now, working to take data, as we've heard, working with community organizations and initiatives like Paula's, and trying to channel funding in a collective impact manner towards those types of initiatives. I want to thank you very much for attending and all of these great questions so far. Thank you very much, Paula and Russ, for enlightening us about the spatial inequalities. And I'll pass things back over.
And thank you, Dr. Smith, for leading this excellent conversation. Just a couple of wrap-up remarks. One is that we did record this evening's event. We are hoping to put it on the church's YouTube channel. We will be having Sunday night series coming up, finishing out with additional topics as have been so beautifully previewed. Particularly the housing and economic mobility conversation we'll be having here, same time, same place, next Sunday. Did you know almost 1/3 of Forsyth County residents have difficulty affording their home? That's one of the questions. So now you already kind of know that's the quiz, one of the quiz questions for next Sunday. Our panelists will include Rich Angino with Third Wave Housing, Kevin Cheshire, Executive Director of the HAWS, Housing Authority, Winston-Salem. We will have Andrea Kurtz, who is with Community Partnerships and Experiential Learning at Wake Forest, but previous to that, she was at United Way for 10-ish years in their strategic housing initiatives group. And then we will have one of Dr. Smith's colleagues from Winston-Salem State, Dr. Craig Richardson, who heads up the Center for the Study of Economic Mobility. And if you have not gone out, if you've never seen a little 10-minute video on YouTube called Bus Stop Jobs, some of the men here saw and heard that video at a men's breakfast last year, but Dr. Richardson will be part of that conversation as well. So it's both housing and economic mobility. That will be moderated by our very own Tracy Moore, who is with Habitat for Humanity as their Director of Advancement. So this evening, as you leave, first of all, I thank you so much. Thank you. The dream of our JNR team, when you figure that we're hosting 5 of these events in the next 5 months, our dream, ultimately, many folks have asked the question, well, what's next? At the end of each evening's program, we're asking people, if you're interested in continuing to engage on the topic, if you would fill out the last page of your handout. Just tear it off, just leave it on your seat. We'll get it after we've all said goodbye for the evening. So that is what's next. But ideally, we want to be more than just learning about problems. We want to understand what's the hard part of the problem. Why is it there? Our guests this evening have done just an awesome job of helping us get started on the path to understanding. And ultimately, we want to be a part. Let's just find one little nibble of the elephant. Just choose one elephant. I mean, we've got lots of elephants, but choose one elephant, take one nibble, and then see if we can come back and take a second nibble. So that is our thinking, and we thank you. And I'm going to ask Reverend Peters if she would come up and just bless us on our way.
Let us pray. Oop. And me not trip. Creator God, we are so grateful for Miss McCoy, Dr. Smith, Dr. Sills, and the work they do. As we process all that we have heard tonight, we ask that you challenge us, that you help us grow, and that through this we are able to change and bring about change. Help our actions to reflect what we have learned tonight. Let this be just a step on our climb for justice. In your name we pray. Amen.